What's going on, YouTube? Mike back here for another album review, and this time we're going to be talking about some more New York death metal. We're going to be talking about Pyrexia's debut album, Sermon of Mockery, released 30 years ago in 1993. Now, Pyrexia, they formed in the year 1990 in the Brooklyn, New York, Long Island area. They put out a demo in 1991. I'd never heard it, never really found it. It's very difficult to find. 1992, they put out another demo called Liturgy of Impurity, and it has some of the songs that were re-recorded for Sermon of Mockery, such as Demigod, Abominate. And 1993, they put out Sermon of Mockery with Daryl Wagner on vocals, Tony Caravella on guitars, Chris Basile on bass, Guy Marchese, who you know from Suffocation, on guitars, and also Mike Andrejko on drums. Now, this is more building upon the path that Suffocation laid out with their debut album, Effigy of the Forgotten, and also Morpheus Descends, Ritual of Infinity. This basically upped the brutality and the heaviness of death metal in general, essentially. Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten, and Morpheus Descends album, they had some slams, but this album had a lot more, and the vocals became even more guttural than ever before. And it just became more bottom end and more slam-like, more crushing, more powerful. Now, Sermon of Mockery, basically one thing that you gotta know about this album is it's really, really fucking heavy and really dark. It's in terms of the darkness, it's up there with like Cannibal Corpse and Deicide, and in terms of like the pure heaviness, it's with their Suffocation. It's like very heavy and very dark, the music itself. Now, one of the best examples is the opening riff of Sermon of Mockery, the title track, track number 1. Where it has, you can tell on this album that it's very bass heavy. Like the guitars have kind of a thin sound. They're kind of drowned out by the bass and the drums, because those are very present and the most in your face in terms of the instrumentation. Now, the vocals on Sermon of Mockery took Frank Mullen's approach in Suffocation and went even about couple semi-steps lower. They're very subwoofer, like very demonic. Very. Now, in terms of the instrumentation, Tony Caravello and Guy Marchese on guitars. Guy Marchese played in Suffocation later. And the guitar riffs are very similar. They're built off those like minor diminished triplets, similar to what Suffocation does in those very technical, short, brief, explosive passages. For example, in the song Sermon of Mockery, towards the end. And also in the song Abominate. And also the song God Itself. That's literally one of the songs. And it's also very down-tuned. The guitars, they're down-tuned to C sharp standard, which is pretty low. Most of the other bands were tuning in around E flat standard, so this is a whole tone lower. It's very low tuned. And one of the best things about this album, a lot of people complain about, is the overwhelming drum sound, but I like the overwhelming drum sound. And the drummer, Mike Andrejko, he is absolutely phenomenal on the drums. It reminds me heavily of like Craig Smilowski of Immolation, like the drumming and the technicality of it, the free form of it, and the aggressiveness of it. It's really powerful drumming. I think it's personally better than Mike Smith's drumming performance on Effigy of the Forgotten. It's more technical, it's even faster, the blast beats, and there's a lot more fills. Now, another credit I have to give is the very solid bass playing of Chris Basile. He's actually the only original member left in the band. All those other guys left a while ago. Chris Basile's bass playing is very in your face and very loud. It's actually one of the most prominent instruments. You can hear it very heavily in the opening track, track number 2, Resurrection. And also, when it comes to the guitar riffs, this really essentialized the concept of like the slam riff. For example, in track number 2, Resurrection. Breakdown at the 30-second mark in the track God, you can hear how it has those palm muted, very percussive sounding riffs where you just beat the crap out of each other in the pit, though that's essentially what a slam riff is. Basically a breakdown that's percussive based, and when you listen to it, you want to just beat the shit out of everyone around you. That's essentially what it's there for. Now, Suffocation, the Pyrexia, the one issue I have with this album that I wish was more, I wish the guitars were more in your face. The drumming, the subwoofer like vocals of Daryl Wagner, the bass playing very, very prominent, but I wish the guitars had more meat on them. They're kind of behind the sound of the drumming and the rhythm section, which is not the best, but I mean, this album was recorded 30 years ago, but the guitars behind, when you listen carefully to the riffs, they're very dark, very heavy, accompanied by the rhythm section, and they're honestly massive. But the problem is the guitar sound isn't the best, but otherwise this album is great. I mean, when I first heard this album, I personally did not like it. I thought it was too brutal for my taste, but I was a little bit younger, but I've grown up more. And this album, man, it's powerful. Like, when you listen to this album in your car, I burned it on CD because I got it off iTunes. It's almost impossible to find this album anywhere. Even on Discogs, Amazon, forget it. eBay, forget it. So I got it off iTunes, burned it on disc, and it's brutal. Let me just say that. This album punishes you as the listener. And one thing that this album does, like, lyrically, it's not as clever as Suffocation. It's more in, like, it's not as clever as Immolation, anywhere near that. It's more about like, oh, God betrayed us. God is doing this to us. Stuff like that. Nothing really too thought-provoking in terms of lyricism. Nothing like that. But this album is solid. Solid 85% for me. That's all I'm going to say. And to be honest, my favorite songs are the opening track, Sermon of Mockery, Resurrection, which is the most brutal song on the album, tied with God. That's towards the end. Demigod is pretty good, has some interesting guitar solos as well as Abominate. It has some abstract ideas, but not as lizard brain as Suffocation is in general. Honestly, very brutal. This pushed the limits of brutality, essentially. A lot of stuff coming out today can't even touch it in terms of brutality and heaviness. And I mean, I could see why this band was classified as the heaviest band in the world at some point for a couple of years. it was really overtaken by ridiculous stuff like Disgorge, Devourment. I'm not a fan of those two bands, but I will admit that is heavier and more brutal. But honestly, like I said, 85 out of 10. Best tracks: Sermon of Mockery, Resurrection, God, Demigod, Abominate. Those are my favorites off the album. And sadly, a lot of these guys, they're not in the band anymore. The only one that's still around is Chris Basile, who's the bass player. Now he plays bass and guitar. I know Daryl Wagner has a much better career in the IT field, which I understand. Death metal doesn't really make you any money. Besides if you're like Cannibal Corpse or Deicide, it's not like a lucrative field. So he's in the IT industry. I know the drummer, Mike Andrejko, he's some IT director for some hospital. But yeah, solid album. You'll listen. If you can somehow find it at a reasonable price, good luck with that. This is Mike, and I'm out.